Think about the items in your pockets right now. A smartphone, some keys, a plastic pen, a pair of synthetic headphones. To you, these are the baseline utilities of modern life. But if you could transport those items back 2,000 years to ancient Rome, Han Dynasty China, or New Kingdom Egypt, you wouldn't just be viewed as an eccentric traveler. You would be seen as a god, possessing objects that no amount of gold could purchase. Today, we tend to measure wealth by numbers on a digital screen, but in the ancient world, wealth was entirely physical, visceral, and deeply sensory. It was an absolute alteration of the human experience that divided humanity into two completely different biological realities. To understand what it was truly like to be a rich, ancient human, you have to strip away the modern assumption that we all inhabit the same basic physical world. For the vast majority of our history, the gap between the ultra-wealthy and the average person wasn't just a matter of lifestyle, it was written directly onto their skin, into their skeletons, and across every single sensory experience of their daily lives. Let's begin with the sensory reality of the ancient world. If you walked through the streets of ancient Rome, Babylon, or Alexandria, the first thing that would hit you would be the overwhelming assault on your senses. For 99% of the population, life was loud, filthy, and intensely pungent. The air smelled of open sewers, wood smoke, decomposing waste, and the unwashed bodies of thousands of people packed into tight quarters. The average human wore coarse, scratchy wool or rough linen that had likely never been thoroughly washed. Their food was a monotonous gray porridge of barley or emmer wheat, occasionally flavored with salt or a rare scrap of dried fish. But if you were part of the elite patrician class, your world was engineered to be entirely frictionless. The moment you stepped inside your villa, the chaos of the city vanished. Ancient wealth was, first and foremost, the ability to insulate yourself from the harsh realities of nature and urbanization. Your home was built around an atrium, an open-air courtyard that drew in clean air and light while keeping the dust and noise of the street outside. The floors beneath your feet weren't hard dirt or rough stone. They were intricate mosaics made of imported marble from Numidia and Greece, polished until they gleamed. This insulation extended to the literal scent of your existence. In a world where everyone smelled of sweat and smoke, the rich smelled of the exotic. They coated themselves in perfumes made from frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from the Horn of Africa, and cinnamon from the edges of the known world. These weren't just personal preferences, they were olfactory flags of status. When a wealthy person walked into a room, you smelled their bank account before they even spoke. And what they wore was equally revolutionary. While the masses wore the natural, dull tones of undyed fabric, the elite wore colors that seemed almost supernatural. The most famous was Tyrian purple, a dye extracted from the hypobranchial gland of the murex sea snail. It took 12,000 snails to produce just 1.5 grams of pure dye, enough to color the trim of a single garment. The resulting color wasn't just purple, it was a deep, rich, blood-red tint that actually grew brighter and more intense when exposed to sunlight. To wear Tyrian purple was to display a level of purchasing power that could command the labor of thousands of fishermen and chemists. It was a visual declaration that you had conquered the scarcity of the natural world. But the differences weren't just superficial. If you examine the bones of ancient humans, the social divide becomes startlingly clear. Modern bioarchaeologists can identify the social status of an ancient skeleton almost instantly without looking at the grave goods buried with it. When looking at the remains of the ancient poor, the bones tell a story of unrelenting physical trauma. You see compressed vertebrae from carrying immense loads, severe osteoarthritis in the knees and hips from a lifetime of agricultural labor, and deep grooves in the teeth called linear enamel hypoplasia, which indicate periods of childhood starvation when the body literally stopped growing. The rich, however, left behind entirely different skeletons. Their bones were thicker and longer, reflecting a childhood filled with high-quality protein, dairy, and clean water. On average, wealthy ancient Romans and Egyptians were several inches taller than their impoverished contemporaries. Their joints showed minimal wear, revealing a life spent in stillness rather than forced labor. But this abundance came with its own biological price. The skeletons of the wealthy frequently show signs of a condition known as diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis, which is heavily linked to obesity and type 2 diabetes. They also suffered from gout, an incredibly painful inflammatory arthritis caused by an excess of uric acid in the blood, brought on by a diet rich in red meat, seafood, and alcohol. In antiquity, being sick from having too much food was the ultimate status symbol. Consider the act of eating itself. For a regular ancient human, food was fuel, a daily calculation of survival. For the wealthy, food was a theater of dominance. A Roman banquet hosted by someone like Lucullus wasn't designed to satisfy hunger, it was designed to display control over distant geographies and natural seasons. Guests were served flamingo tongues, dormice fattened on acorns, jellyfish and wild boar stuffed with live birds that burst out when the meat was carved. They drank wines that had been aged for decades, mixed with snow brought down from the mountains by teams of runners who ran in relays to prevent it from melting before it reached the city. Think about the sheer logistics required to put ice in a drink during a Mediterranean summer 2,000 years ago. It required an army of enslaved labor, an unbroken chain of human muscle working against the sun, just so a wealthy man could feel a chill on his lips. This was the true definition of ancient wealth, the ability to bend time, space, and human flesh to your immediate whim. This absolute control over other human beings is perhaps the hardest aspect of ancient wealth for a modern mind to fully comprehend. Today, the wealthiest people on Earth hire personal assistants, drivers, and chefs. But in the ancient world, wealth meant owning people outright. A wealthy Roman or Egyptian did not live in a home, they lived inside a human machine. Every single micro-task of daily life was assigned to a specific slave, whose entire existence was dedicated to that function. There were slaves whose only job was to fold your toga, slaves to maintain the temperature of your private bathhouses, slaves to walk ahead of you in the street and gently clear a path through the crowd, and slaves called nomenclators, whose sole responsibility was to remember the names and faces of everyone you met so they could whisper them in your ear before you greeted them. Your hands rarely touched anything heavy or unclean. If you wanted to travel across the city, you didn't walk or ride a horse, you stepped into a litter, a luxurious couch shielded by silk curtains, carried on the shoulders of 4 or 8 physically imposing slaves. As you moved through the crowded streets, you floated above the mud and the filth, looking down at the population from a literal and figurative height. This lack of physical friction fundamentally altered how the wealthy perceived time. For the poor, time was dictated by the sun. When darkness fell, life stopped because oil for lamps was a luxury. But the rich conquered the night, illuminating their palaces with thousands of clean-burning bronze lamps. They lived in an artificial world of permanent convenience, untethered from the natural rhythms of the planet. Yet the irony of ancient wealth is that it was entirely dependent on an environment of extreme scarcity. Their luxury only existed because millions lived in squalor. Today, an ordinary person can walk into a grocery store and buy spices from 4 continents, heat their home instantly, and access medicine that can cure infections that routinely killed ancient kings. We have democratized the material miracles that ancient elites spent empires to achieve. We have inherited all of their comforts, but in our rush to build a world of total convenience, we may have forgotten how to inhabit the quiet stillness that they valued above all else. We have built the palaces of the ancient kings, but we are still searching for the peace they tried so desperately to buy.